Thank everyone for joining today. I really appreciate it. We're talking about encryption. So yeah, my name is Wolfgang Goerlich. I'm the Director of Security Strategy here at CBI. And as such, of course, we get to see a lot of different security programs. We get to see a lot of different organizations that are doing very well and some that struggle. And one of the things that is always on the forefront of my mind is how can we take the lessons from the former and share them with the latter? How can we look deeply into success stories and extract out valuable nuggets that we can all apply? And encryption is a perfect example of that, and it's a ripe example of that because encryption is such a complex topic, right? You can say, oh, we're secure, we encrypted that, and that can mean a million different things to a million different people in a million different contexts. So today, the abstract is very simple. Perfect. All right. So the agenda is I'm going to cover the problem, right? Which unfortunately, I'm sure all too many of us on this call are aware of. I'm going to look at how you can measure your encryption maturity and how it can decide which technologies need to go where and when is the right time to phase them in the broader context of the threats, the adversaries we all face, and in the broader context of the regulatory environment that so many of us operate under. And then finally, we'll look at how to verify that those technologies are indeed mitigating the risk and talk a little bit about preparing for the encryption sprawl. And that point, we'll turn it on over to Mark. So the problem we all face. This just came out 2 days ago. This news is out of St. Louis. I am in by no means suggesting this company is unusual. As a matter of fact, it's practically the default these days. This corporation just released a press release. They had nearly a million people, and they had records on these nearly million people. These records included personally identifiable information, personal health information, doctor's visits, the whole 9 yards as part of research projects. And these records got onto 6 hard drives. And these 6 hard drives, as part of an IT refresh project and whatnot, went missing. And so now they had to publish it out. Like I said, a couple days ago, check the press release if you're interested in finding out more. But they had to publish out, hey, we lost a million people's information, and they had to go through breach reporting and everything else. And I know from having sat in on so many of these types of meetings that somewhere someone's like, what the heck? We were encrypting. What do you mean we lost these records? How can we possibly have lost these records? Didn't you tell me that the database was encrypted? Yeah, well, the database is encrypted. Okay, well, didn't you tell me that we're doing hard drive encryption? We are on some systems. Didn't you tell me that? Yeah, I did, and we did pass the audit, and we are compliant, but there's this business process, and it dumped everything out of our secure systems, and they put them on files, and now those files are on hard drives, and now we don't know where the hard drives are. and I wish this was the rare occasion, right? I wish this was the abnormality, but the reality is, with as broad as our systems are today, and as broad of a topic as encryption has become, it's very, very difficult to know whether or not we've got the right encryption in the right place, and very difficult to know whether or not once we put an encryption control in motion, if it stays in motion and continues to protect us against that risk. So what is the problem? The problem is we're seeing common mistakes that lead to encryption or lead to breaches, right? Those can be things like key management. They can be misconfigured ciphers. They can be encryption at the wrong layers, which is most likely what happened in the previous example. And we're also seeing misunderstandings of the regulatory compliance requirements, and that can be from the auditor, that can be from internal audit, that can be the IT folks who are interpreting it, any number of things. But what happens is, in our rush to satisfy any one given standard, we have deployed a patchwork of point solutions, and now we're trying to maintain those, ensure that they're up to date, ensure they're properly administered and properly configured. And this problem has been compounding and has led to what we see today, which is encryption is a fantastic control, but it's not addressing the risk. So to address it, we really need to step back and look at it as an IT maturity concern, right? Look at it from the perspective of building a mature program that creates sustainability around these types of controls. Now, you recall, if you guys were in on our IT maturity level, the three process that I love, which starts off with, hey, let's pick a controls framework. Could be something high level, could be something like industry, like NERC, PCI, could be something very tactical. But start with that controls framework, assess to that controls framework, and overlay on top of that a maturity framework. So we have our controls, here's what we need to be doing. We have our maturity, here's the level that we're doing it, 1, 2, 3. And then we can do the final step, which is, hey, get a cape, wear a cape, fly. Figure out what we need to do to address the deficiencies at any one given point. Figure out what we need to do to raise the maturity at any one given point. And more importantly, figure out the points that are most important to our organization in terms of defending against the adversaries and meeting those requirements. So from an encryption perspective, we at CBI have developed with my team over the past year what we're referring to as the CBI 8 domains of encryption. So what we did there was we took what we've seen in terms of breaches from incident response and security operations. One of the ones that I almost always go back to whenever I'm doing, like, leading a class in threat modeling or whatever, or giving a talk, I always go back to this example, and it was a great example. It was a financial services organization, hypothetical, and there was files being transferred, and they had encryption at every single level you might imagine. They had, TLS HTTPS for the web console to get to your files. They had SFTP so that the files themselves were being transferred in encrypted state. They even had PGP encryption on the files. But what they also had was, to make life simpler, a lot of the keys, the private keys for PGP and for other things, on that server itself. So in this particular scenario that we often walk people through when we're doing incident response planning, that server gets compromised, those keys are now available, and those keys are then used by the criminal to decrypt. That's just one example, and there's millions more that come to us all the time, especially from our red team, who was able to consistently get at data by navigating and going through the chinks between the different encryptions. That came to us, was analyzed, was cross-referenced, and divided up into 8 domains. Now, with those 8 domains, we then went and referenced the major standards, the regulatory compliance mandates and whatnot, and aligned with what we see the attackers do, what the requirements are from your auditors. So these are things like, hey, what does our overall security program look like for encryption? Are we checking the keys? Are we checking the ciphers regularly? Do we have the right policies and procedures in place? What are we doing for authentication authorization? Those encryption keys, are we managing them right? It's amazing to me how much math and how much science and how much technology goes into an encryption control, and it can be defeated by a less than 1K text file if that 1K text file is in the wrong hands or in the wrong spot. So what are we doing for encryption keys? Are we rotating them when people leave? How are we protecting data at the database layer and making sure it doesn't get extracted in a way that isn't clear? What are we doing for data at rest? Our applications, right, as we're processing and doing transactions, what are we doing there? And of course, our archival, our backup tapes, our hard drives, right, that get retired. How are we handling each one of those 8 domains? So we've got 8 domains of controls that we then go ahead and check using interviews and walkthroughs and technical testing. Coming out of that, we can then begin to determine, right, as an organization, do we have the right technologies in place? Do we have the right methods to address these concerns? And that is simply a matter of mapping up and down, right? So when you map up, hey, I got this business case. I need to transfer files. I need to open up a research portal. I need to let people do work, right? I need to enable the business process. At the same time, I've got some requirements because of the type of data it is, it needs to be encrypted this way. Because of the type of people it is, they need to be able to access it that way. We need to have a portal. It needs to be easy, because if it's not easy, they're going to bypass it. All these types of requirements that we start gathering from the various stakeholders. So we map those requirements, we map the control requirements, and we figure out what is the level for this particular system, or for this particular technology, or for this particular business process that we need to have those 8 domains at. Does it need to be full across the board? Maybe, maybe not. It all depends on what the risk is and what the value of that process is, and of course, what the requirements are from the organization. So we can do that mapping. We can take those controls, we can use them as a requirement, we can use them to benchmark how the new technology goes in against old technologies, and we can also begin to benchmark one particular technology in one particular organization, let's say an EMR in healthcare to another EMR in healthcare, and get an idea again of where the strengths are, where people are succeeding, and where the issues and areas of concern are, and share those strengths back and forth so we can all learn together and build better roadmaps. And when we get to that point, we'll get to the roadmap, we're like, all right, we need this type of encryption. It's available on these particular technologies. We've got 80% of this in-house, 20% we may need to add. And as we build out the roadmaps, we can begin to figure out ways that we can use our in-house technology to satisfy these controls, to meet the encryption mandates, and to do it in a way that's sustainable, that we're confirming it's still good, that we have the document policies and processes in place, and that over the longer term, it's not going to be breached. And that is the key part, right? When we have the technologies in place, we almost invariably find this whenever we're doing an approach that involves a maturity assessment, is that because we've invested in a point product here, a point product there, because we've layered on technology, in this system that had these 3 features for this other business case, but oh, by the way, it also will do VPN and encryption for communication channels. Whenever we take a maturity approach and lay out the top level requirements, such as the 8 domains, and map them to what we have, we invariably find areas where we can consolidate technology and we can leverage what we already have to get the job done, which is perfect. I love it when we can increase our security posture with equipment we already have, with simply adjusting the procedures we're using and adding some training. Let's talk a little bit about verifying security. You get the technology in place, and you get the policies and procedures in place. And of course, not every system is going to be to the same level of maturity. It shouldn't be, right? You should be focusing on areas that drive more business and are more valuable. So you're going to have different levels of maturity, and you're going to have an area that, when implemented, is very secure. The next question is, how do you make sure it really is mitigating the risk? And how do you make sure it's really continuously maintained? And I'll point to disk encryption as a prime example. For every organization that has disk encryption on all their endpoints, whatever you look at it, there's always that pocket that the disk encryption didn't deploy, or the disk encryption is circumvented because someone has a BitLocker sticker on their laptop, or whatever it may be, right? There's always those pockets of risk that only exist when you turn over the rocks and look closely. So after we assess and plan and implement controls, now we go back and regularly verify to make sure that those controls are being maintained and upheld in the right way. And the way to do that is technical testing, right? Your scenario-based penetration test. We've got this data over here, can you get to it? And oftentimes that would be by going to the encryption control, being stopped by it, and then the determined attacker is going to work around it. They're going to look for areas where those files are decrypted or transferred into clear or what have you. So the scenario-based penetration testing to make sure that the risk is being mitigated by the controls, and also the control-based pen testing to make sure that the control that was put in place is still running, is still operating, is still covering the risk that it was designed to do. Walking around and looking for disk keeper passwords, right? Those types of things. And this becomes even more important as we begin to get more and more systems. So one of the things that we so often see with traditional IT departments is we've gotten a decent handle on our networks, right? We've gotten a decent handle on our computers. We've gotten a decent handle on the equipment in our data centers and in the back room. But of course, we've shifted into the age of IT consumerization. There's more technology coming on all the time with things like control systems and Internet of Things. We've got non-traditional IT being brought into the workplace quite regularly. We've got, the bring your own everything. We've got everything as a service thanks to the cloud. And what that means is we need to have a programmatic approach and a maturity approach to handle the technologies we have today and to allow us to have the scope to continue to grow as we have this sprawl tomorrow. And I'm going to turn it over now to Mark to talk about what that sprawl means and where the systems are growing and how this particular technologies in encryption can fit into those various niches. And again, as you're thinking about this, keep in mind, once it's there, it now needs to be maintained and sustained and plugged into an overall security program. So with that, man, over to you, Mark.
Hey, appreciate that, Wolfgang. I learned something there. A lot of great information in terms of that encryption sprawl. I really like the sort of the 8 elements and facets that you described. I think that was very, very accurate, very helpful. So transitioning a little bit, for the audience members, my name is Mark Yakabuski, the VP of Business Development Strategy for Gemalto. You may formally know that many of the people that you interact with Gemalto as part of SafeNet. So we were acquired by Gemalto about a year ago. Currently, the business unit within Gemalto that runs as old SafeNet is identity and data protection. Happy to have the opportunity to speak and work with Wolfgang and to these audience members. And today I'm going to talk a little bit about sort of 3 subjects, Internet of Things, big data, and cloud, and how they're all interrelated in specifically around cryptography and encryption. Talk a little bit about why they're interrelated, but more importantly, give you some real use cases from our customers about problems they're solving and what's driving those solutions, and then how they're solving the security problems, because the security problems are certainly not the sexiest part of trying to grow a business, for anybody who's in the industry and trying to create new solutions. They're always about trying to increase revenue, reduce cost, and reduce risk. And what we want to show is that those three things can be married together, and hopefully I'll be able to do that in the next few minutes here. So the thing we want to talk about, I want to talk a little bit about the big data opportunity. You could have taken any 3 of these: big data, cloud, or IoT. There's certainly lots of hype, and for good reason, around all 3. I think the 3 of them are all interrelated from a technology and a business perspective. I'll talk a little bit about that. Talk, as I said, about what's driving it, and then some real life use cases of how we're helping solving some of the security problems and helping our customers grow their business. So big data, like a lot of things that get a lot of hype in the market, there's a lot of definitions of what big data is. There's a couple here that I pull up, and I think they work for my personal definition of what big data is, and many of the customers and partners that I've worked with is that it really, the proliferation of data really drives things to a point that it's the manipulation of data when it gets to a certain amount of size and it's happening all in real time, present real significant logistics to manipulate that data. And as we all know, the gathering of data is extremely important, but it's the what can we do with that data to make intelligent decisions, use them for business analytics. So that the second part of that manipulation is for anytime we have that data, whether it comes from one place or many, how are we using it? We're analyzing it because we want to make decisions, whether those decisions are about as a business entering into a new market, trying to figure out how we reduce costs in a market that we've been around in a long time, and some of our solutions are getting commoditized, or even in how to reduce risk. And the opportunity has been well documented. So Gartner and Wikibon here can show you that the investment. Companies making investments in big data, it's close to 75% of companies are making an active investment in big data, and the market is expected to grow from a $30+ billion market in 2015 to more than double by 2020 and be a $60+ billion market. And I think that the combination of the three things that I talked about earlier will be a very big part of driving that. So big data, the cloud, and IoT, how are they related in relatively simple terms? The Internet of Things, whether it be you own you bought one of the Fitbit bands or a watch, or you have a smart meter in your home, or you have a smart TV or a smart fridge or a smart toaster, or the connected automobiles. It's driving an immense, an exponential amount of data that is getting pushed into our systems, our IT systems, and we're trying to figure out how to consume that, right? So that Internet of Things is going to directly drive big data analytics opportunities, and I think we're in the infancy of that. And largely, when you talk about trying to take advantage of big data opportunities, both for storage and compute, really the most obvious choice is that you're going to look for some cloud capacity, whether that be a private cloud or a public cloud. I'm not at all here to promote one versus the other, but it's just a black and white fact that if you're trying to do data analytics, business analytics on the amount of data that will come for big data opportunities, you're going to need an immense amount of storage and capacity. So switching gears a little bit around on the security side, right? And an example, the IoT effect, and I'll talk about one example around smart metering. And many of you, in the audience listening and watching this presentation probably have a smart meter in your home. They've been rolled out quite widely around all over the world, and so those smart meters, those smart meters are, if you take an example of a traditional meter, where you might remember that someone from the utility company would come to your house, and whether they'd knock on your door and tell you that they were there or not, they might, and then they'd go to the side and they'd read your meter and they'd tell you how off it was based upon what they'd been billing you on a monthly basis. Well, if you take the example of a smart meter, if that smart meter is taking readings every 30 minutes, which is fairly typical of most of the smart meters in the market today, that's 18,000 reads a year per household. For a city of 100,000 people, not a very big city, a fairly moderate city, 1.8 billion reads a year. And then if you extrapolate that out and talk about a city, of 10 million people, you could see the amount of just data that's going to flow in. So it's a great opportunity for data analytics and for people to make better decisions, and smart metering companies to make better decisions on both halves of that. But it's a huge risk in customer data and protection. And there's some smart meters and other Internet of Things that are actually looking at including PI information that Wolfgang talked about earlier, like actually payment information, so that they can automatically bill or capture if they want to overproduce or underproduce for some of these pieces, they can pay up or pay down. And it's all about, having a seamless and more automated user experience, but the data, the risk of PII, not in this case health information, but just personally identifiable information at risk is very, very significant. Wolfgang talked about, encryption sprawl. And, having been involved in the, cryptography encryption industry for 16 years now, his comments are very applicable to most of the people that I've dealt with for that 15 or 16 years. And I think that that sprawl is becoming a bigger problem. And when he ended his part, he talked about it, right, which is about the fact that, the closed data center, the old days of having a firewall and everything inside is absolutely not the reality of which we're in anymore. And that's all about reasons for driving new business and growth. But it changes not, it starts not with the encryption sprawl, it starts with the data sprawl. The fact that the data is everywhere, right? The data is down on your mobile, it's sitting in your car, it's down in your back-end systems, it's sitting in your, if you have a smart TV, smart fridge, etc. It is everywhere and constantly moving and constantly evolving. And again, driven by business needs, consumer needs, and looking for better experience to be driven down through into the market. So talking about that and moving to, some examples of, Wolfgang used the example of the company that lost 6 hard drives and almost 1 million records for their customers and wasn't sure where they're at. So the research shows that in 2014, there was over 1 billion records exposed across 1,500 different breaches, and most of that data was not encrypted. And the proliferation of that, we all hear about data hacks and breaches on a daily or weekly basis. I think some of the ones that are most recent and top of mind because they hit us personally were a couple of the data breaches that happened around some of the automotive manufacturers where, Fiat Chrysler unfortunately was proven to be hackable remotely by 2 engineers who took control of a car, from 100 miles away, and were able to get into the logic controlling system in that car and actually drive it. Tesla, unfortunately, was also hacked in a fairly similar manner and was proven to be able to, someone could remotely hack into the logic controlling system on the Tesla and actually shut it down while someone was driving. And those are both resulted in good responses from both companies around how to address those problems and fix them. But they were also costly in the area of certainly tens, if not hundreds of millions of dollars across what they would cost for responses to and just general viability in the market in terms of the brand. So some customer use cases I'll talk a little bit about, give you some real life use cases, and again I'm gonna tie these back to what drives our decisions both as people and as enterprises and as companies. And I really bring it back to 3 R's, and it's sort of like 3.5 R's because one of them is a bit of a cheat, but one of them, revenue, about driving more revenue, increasing our market shares, right? Looking for new use cases, reduction of cost, reduction of expenses, and then the reduction of risk. And I'll tie back to use cases that were directly customers using some of our cryptography and encryption products to drive revenue increase and risk reduction, where they were using some Gemalto-based products for enabling that reduction of risk. Sorry. So back to the smart metering example that I used earlier. There was a use case where we had someone who was asking us that they were building out a predictive consumption analytics application that was, and this was this was actually a smart metering company who were, you know, a partner of a smart metering company, so that was leveraging the smart meter to build a predictive consumption analytics program so that they could drive down costs. And those costs were about um, they were buying power from the utility brokerage exchange, and what they wanted to figure out was at what points in time, based on predictive consumption analytics, could they buy less power, buy more power. So very real time ability to make a decision based on how they would buy power and then sell that to their consumers. And they needed to pull the data down from their smart meters, and then they had a cloud-based predictive consumption analytics program of which they wrote, and they needed the cloud for that, for both storage and for compute power, and they needed secure access to those applications in the cloud, and then more importantly, they wanted customer control of their encryption and keys in the cloud. So Wolfgang talked about, you know, you can have some great encryption strategies and you can encrypt everything. But if you do, as you know, he brought up the example that you had everything encrypted on a server, but the encryption keys for those data points, database files, whatever it might be, were actually stored on the server as well. So by getting the server, you got the data and the keys to decrypt it. It is a very real life example. And when you move to the cloud, what we know is customers are very wary of, will I still have control of my customer encryption keys? And the products that we have allow you to stand up enterprise application storage, whether they be on-premise, hybrid, or all the way up to public cloud, and maintain the control of those keys outside the applications that access them. So another one, and this one's interesting in that it was actually this was a large U.S.-based mortgage financial services company, and what they were looking to do was find a quicker, more cost-effective way to approve or disapprove mortgages. So they were really looking for, how do I make quicker decisions on reducing risk and fraud, but also for the people that I do want to give mortgages to, how do I make those decisions really quickly? And they did two things. They first moved their development machines to the cloud, and they used some protection mechanisms for virtual machines that we have that work with various cloud providers. And they wrote their mortgage risk application up in the cloud, but they also then decided that they were going to run that mortgage risk application up in the cloud, largely because they realized we need the storage and the compute power. But they also had another very significant want as a customer. They wanted a multi-cloud capability for their applications and for their encryption and key management strategies. So they worked with two cloud providers to stand up mirrored infrastructure, and they wanted their key management infrastructure. And it's a good example of where Wolfgang talked about sprawl, even sprawl outside your data center now into a multi-cloud environment. But what they wanted and what they got was an enterprise key management strategy that allowed them to move to multi-cloud and have a homogeneous single enterprise key management strategy. So I think when I talked a little bit about earlier, 1 billion records breached in 2014, and largely one of the things that we noticed when we looked at this breach was the increase in two things specifically over the last 6 quarters. And I know it's not the best graph, but if you look at these two graphs here, there's two things that increased significantly on this top line here, which was the identity theft and the malicious outsider. And whereas before we used to talk about, the insider threat being predominantly where someone would look to hack or breach our records, that's absolutely still a very significant threat. But in the last year, we've seen an increase almost of 50% of the malicious outsider trying to attack in. And that's largely driven by some of the things we talked about, driven by that that data sprawl. That data sprawl, and then how do you make sure you keep up with your encryption and key management sprawl, right? And so the Internet of Things will drive more and more big data applications, and big data applications will drive more and more people to need the compute and the storage power of cloud. And so that's going to continue, and it's making that data, it lives everywhere, and the encryption policies and controls and the controls of those keys also needs to live everywhere. So I mentioned this earlier, and you may or may not caught it, but of those 1,500 breaches and 1 billion records in 2014, how much of it was encrypted? Shockingly, only 4% of it was encrypted. And I think that is for me a big sign in that at times we believe that we've moved to, that there is a lot of encryption happening, but it really is true that most of the records of which have been, breached in the last 24 months, most of those, that number would certainly be higher in 2015, and we have a new study that we're analyzing now, and I would assume that hopefully is double or triple what it was in 2014. But the majority of the data which is getting breached is not encrypted. So wrapping up a little bit, and this is more just about some of the other things that we believe our customers need to think about when they think about making choices around encryption posture and then cryptography solutions is, does my cryptography solution work with my other applications? And Wolf talked about application encryption and transactions being one of the 8 tenets and elements to consider. One of the things we pride ourselves in is that we work with over 500 different technology partners that can leverage our enterprise key management and hardware security modules in their encryption and cryptography solutions. We offer full customer control in a public cloud, and again, that's all the way from an on-premise solution to a hybrid cloud to a public cloud, and even as I showed you, a multi-cloud solution. And we didn't talk a lot about this, in terms of the solutions, but have solutions that help you meet, a lot of compliance and standards, FIPS, Common Criteria, PCI, and some regional standards that I've listed there in Brazil and Italy and Singapore, etc. And last but not least, in terms of, closing, I talked a lot about proliferation of data and cloud and big data and IoT and how they all come together, and they're being driven by business needs, revenue and reduction of risk and reduced costs. But in an encryption solution, what we have in the Gemalto portfolio is a lot of really great elements, but anybody's encryption solution needs to be a layered security approach, where you work on controlled access, storage and management of keys, and encryption of data, and in that dynamic is only increasing as we see the proliferation of data and the encryption sprawl. So in closing that, I'll pass it back to Wolfgang.
Hey, thanks so much, Mark. So yeah, we've got data sprawl, right? We've got encryption sprawl, and in response, we're deploying IT solutions, driven by, and I love the 3 R's: the revenue, the reduction of expenses, and reduction of risk. What's always needed, of course, is to map these solutions back to the security program framework, to assess it regularly, make sure it's actually is meeting the risk and is reducing the expense, and then maintain and advance the maturity of those controls. And encryption in some ways is no different from a maturity perspective, and in many ways is vastly different due to the scope, the breadth, and all the sprawl we've talked about today. So Matt, do we have any questions?
We didn't have any questions during the presentation. However, what we'll be doing following later today or early tomorrow, we'll be sending out an email to everybody that attended. In there will be some additional information about Gemalto and CBI encryption assessments, as well as ways to get in touch with you, Wolf, and a version of the presentation recorded so they can view it and share it with other people within their organization.
Excellent, excellent. So yeah, take a look for that email for more information, the recorded version. And if you ever want to discuss the encryption in general or the maturity in particular with myself or my team, you can reach us at CBI Security Strategists at cbihome.com. Thanks a lot for joining us today.